All right, so let me just introduce you briefly. So, if people don't already know, Rabbi Dr. Israel Drazin, author of at least 54 books, if not more. He's also an Army veteran, a retired brigadier general. I myself was also in the military. That appeals to me a lot. Is there anything you want to say about yourself, sir?
No, that's fine. I'm also a lawyer and a rabbi. I have a PhD in Judaic studies. I got it when I worked on the Targum, which is the Aramaic translation of the 5 books of Moses. I also have a couple of master's degrees, one on Hebrew literature and also one on psychology. My family was always interested in psychology. Let me see what else. I think that's about it.
I take a similar approach like you. I consider myself Orthodox because I try to keep the laws to the best of my ability, both rabbinic and Torah laws. However, I differ from many people on what I consider law, while everyone else seems not to have a problem including many customs, minhagim, agadata, as binding laws, things that one has to do but also has to believe. That's where I differ from many people, and I think this is my Maimonidean streak. That I think the Rambam, the greatest philosopher the Jewish world has ever seen, always made a distinction. Not just the Rambam, our sages, Chazal, always made a distinction between the rabbinic and essentially anything in rabbinic literature that's not prescriptive. So you are clearly a thinker and a searcher. Does it concern you much the road orthodoxy has taken nowadays, which I would say is extremely religiously to the right?
In answer to that question, yes, I don't identify with that kind of thinking. I don't think that a Jew needs to live according to the most stringent interpretation of the law. I think that if there are views by recognized scholars, recognized rabbis, which are more lenient, I think one could follow that. In regard to one point that you made in your comment, I feel very strongly in regard to the matter of believing. I don't like the concept at all. I don't think that Judaism requires belief. The idea of belief is not in the Hebrew Bible. I don't think it's in Tanakh at all, really, for that matter. Belief, as I mentioned to you the other day, is the acceptance as true, that which logic and science and the senses say is not true. I believe that, and I just use the word that I don't like, I think that the concept of belief was introduced by Paul, the founder of Christianity, that he was a Jew very much interested in converting non-Jews to Judaism as he understood it. And he saw that the non-Jews could not accept certain things such as circumcision and keeping kosher. So he came up with the idea that as long as you believe, I'm not sure if he, at the moment, whether he said as long as you accept Jesus, and if he did say that, what did he mean? I can't think of that right at the moment. And in any event, he came up with the idea that you don't have to be circumcised, you don't have to eat kosher as long as you believe. And that's where it came from. And I dislike that entirely. Now, it is true that Maimonides, in his work called Chalik, which is an introduction to the 10th chapter of the Talmudic tractate of Sanhedrin, at the end of it, he enumerates 13 principles of Judaism. which people understand to be 13 things that they're supposed to believe in. I go along with the idea that many scholars have, and which I think is an extremely important concept to understand in order to understand Maimonides, that he wrote for two different groups. He wrote for the intellectual, and he wrote for the common person. For example, you find statements in the Guide of the Perplexed which seem to indicate that he believed in angels, and you have others where he clearly doesn't believe in angels. That's because he was writing for the two different groups. And he says that right at the beginning in his introduction to the guide. In regard to the 13 principles, I go along with the scholars who take the position that Maimonides himself did not accept these 13 principles as being true. For example, one of them is that the Torah that we have in our hands today is exactly what was received originally. He knew that there were a number of changes made in the Torah, in the wording, and therefore he couldn't have accepted as true that statement that the Torah in our hands today is the same.
I actually remember you saying that in one of your books, that he says that the most accurate version we have is the Aleppo Codex, and that contradicted him saying that the Torah we have now is the same Torah that we received on Har Sinai.
Yeah.
To let people know about these books, I think there's currently 5 of them, but I have 3 of them called The Mysteries of Judaism. If you really want to find a book that you will learn something out of every page, I mean something you didn't know, please pick up those books. Regarding the Rambam, I can't agree with you more. I think not just concepts like saying that the Sefer Torah we have nowadays is the same one that was given on Har Sinai, even the notion like Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead, which, as you know, he was forced to write an apology for because he excluded it from Hilchos Malachim. The belief in Mashiach, which, if you go back to Sefer HaMitzvot, that he just ties it to the belief in a king, completely different to the Ubermensch that people are waiting for nowadays. It makes me feel that, yes, the Rambam was more of a politician when he was trying to influence people, and he knew that if he just wrote for one audience, his books would have been burned, like they were, but I think it was just more Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, that was burned, and he would have been less influential. But many people use the Rambam's principles. As a matter of fact, there's a rabbi, his name is Mark Shapiro. I think he's from Yeshiva Scranton. He wrote a book called The Limits of Orthodox Theology, where he brings down many different rabbis who had a problem with the Rambam classifying belief into 13 principles. Also, the Radbaz writes that a Jew is essentially not commanded to believe in anything. He's just commanded to do. Sefer HaIkarim, Rabbi Yosef Albo, limits belief to 3. And we know the Rambam has 13, which tells you that no one has a monopoly on belief. Now, although I don't think anything is mandatory to be believed, I don't think belief is detrimental. I mean, I think belief, if it's limited, could be good and beneficial. For example, there are some beliefs that are tied to actual mitzvot. Like, for example, the reason we keep Shabbos, or one of the reasons, is because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So there you have a belief that's tied to an action. So it's not essentially like believing in something that doesn't appear in the Chumash at all, like the resurrection of the dead. This seems to be almost a tenet of our belief system, as well as Torah from Sinai, that one should believe that at least the transmission began on Mount Sinai and ceased at the end of Deuteronomy. I think these are beneficial beliefs to have, and the problem I see with society today is that they put no limit on belief. That means because you believe in Har Sinai, you also have to believe that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai received the Zohar in a cave, or that every medrash that appears in the books of Gadata in the Talmud are absolutely true. In this case, I think that too much faith is a bad thing, but faith in general, I don't think that it should be discouraged. What do you think?
I think I don't exactly agree with you on that point. It's not a matter of faith that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day. I don't accept that as a matter of belief. As a matter of fact, I don't believe it at all. I don't think that the chapter 1 of Genesis and chapter 2 of Genesis are more like parables. I think that, if anything, those two chapters encourage us to look into the laws of nature, that if we want to understand about God, we have to take a look at that which God either created or formed, and that's the laws of nature. So I observe the Shabbos not because I'm convinced that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Again, I'm convinced, if anything, that it's not true. But I observe the Shabbos because this is something that has been observed by our people, my ancestors, your ancestors, for countless years, and has many great benefits to it. And associated with it is the notion that God created or formed the world. How this was done, I haven't the slightest idea, and I don't think anyone has any idea. So I don't think that I have to believe in anything. My mind is totally open. And
but not that you have to believe, but that it might be beneficial in certain cases. Like most people, the only reason they'll want to keep Shabbos is because they can illustrate it within the narrative. They could point back and say, well, because I acknowledge that God created the world in such a fashion, or was the creator at all, this is one illustration of that, by me resting like God rested.
I don't think that I need to appreciate the Shabbos because of my belief in how creation occurred. I don't think that. When I went off to join the army, my father said to me, make sure that you observe the Shabbos, because more than the issue of you keeping the Shabbos keeps you in Judaism. And I think my father made a very good point. So that's one of the many values that I see in the Shabbos. I enjoy the Shabbos. I look forward to it. I like to read on the Shabbos. I like I like the Kiddush. I know what it means to me, but it has nothing to do with belief. I don't.
Well, that sounds more like of a devotional understanding. But to go back, let's say, to the times before the temple was destroyed, where Judaism was lived in a completely legal fashion, and I agree, there was no litmus test essentially on belief, but I've coined this term called halachic belief, that when men in the Sanhedrin wanted the Jewish people to profess a certain idea, to believe in a certain idea, they would introduce it into the liturgy, saying that, okay, you technically don't have to believe in this, but you're expected, when you daven, to say this bracha. For example, the bracha regarding Techiyat HaMeitim, that if you utter it, in some way you're professing a halachic belief, right, a legal belief, but not that you yourself are convinced of it, because there is no thought police in Judaism. Would you say that the judges, those who sat on the Sanhedrin, we are commanded to heed the instructions of those who sat on the court who had smicha going back to Moshe Rabbeinu? I'm not saying rabbis today. Rabbis, I think smicha was dissolved in around the 4th century of the Common Era. Do you believe in the traditional Orthodox understanding that because of Parsha Shoftim, we're commanded to listen to the Beis Din HaGadol?
I don't accept most of the ideas that you mentioned there. For example, I don't think, let me say it in a positive way, I consider the Siddur as not containing what we must believe. As a matter of fact, there are a number of things in the Siddur which I think are things that I reject. I think that the Siddur, contrary to what other people think, I think it's a compendium of different things that our ancestors put together, and it should be taken as an interesting intellectual document, letting us know that what some of our people thought was important, but a lot of it is not important at all. For example, when we take out the Torah, we recite I don't do it, but a lot of people do recite a thing from the Zohar.
It's called Brich Shemay.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's pure nonsense. When I tell you that I'm Orthodox and I follow the practices, there are certain practices that I don't follow, and that's one of them.
The Rub didn't follow it also because he had a problem saying angels and the sons of God. There's some statements that the Rub had a problem with.
Yeah, the third verse of Shalom Aleichem is problematical. So what I'm trying to say is that in regard to the Siddur, I don't think that I don't read it as truth. I read it as history, and I find it inspirational. Though ever since I was a child, I never read the so-called prayers thinking that I was communicating with God. I read them as a collection of different items, and therefore, when I read them carefully to try and understand what was the point that the document was trying to pass on to me. So, therefore, when I sat in shul as a youngster, and everyone was singing L'cha Dodi, I read it carefully and discovered that it has absolutely nothing to do with the Shabbos. Everyone was saying that it has to do with the Shabbos. It was ridiculous that it had nothing to do with the Shabbos. And I thought about it, analyzed the words, and I came up with the understanding, which I believe is true, that it was a document that was composed by a mystic, and it was designed to, like a number of other things in the prayer book, designed to teach us about the combining of two of the 10 elements of God to bring about the Mashiach.
I just want to touch on this because those of us who try to be somewhat Maimonidean in our approach to Judaism make a distinction between later editions like Brik Shemay, the whole Kabbalah Shabbos liturgy from L'cha Dodi to Eishes Hayil. But most people don't know that Eishes Hayil has nothing to do with blessing your wife. It has to do with basically focusing and worshiping the female aspect of the Sefirot. Now,
I agree. I figured that out too.
Right. Also, Shalom Aleichem, like you said, it's basically praying to angels. These are all later additions. If you go back to, let's say, the Rambam Siddur, which also appears in Mishnah Torah, it's very thin. All it has is the Amidah and the Shema. It includes things that are not paramount, but he acknowledges are just customs. But the goal is to go back to the liturgy that was sanctioned by people who had smicha, who sat on the Sanhedrin, who throughout Jewish history people understood were sanctioned by the Torah itself. God tells Moses to establish a court of 70 elders, right? 71 with himself, and then tells us that in all matters of controversy, we should look towards this court. But what they ruled into existence was very small. It essentially wasn't even the Gemara. It was just the Mishnah and the Brises, because the Amoraim didn't have smicha. They didn't have the authority to rule. So if you limited Judaism to that, then you would see that our belief system is a lot more rational than what we see nowadays. Even according to the Rambam's Machzor, look at Davin, like Rosh Hashanah in like 45 minutes, right? Compared to the 5 hours with all the piyutim that were crept in by the Arizal and all these mystics, So if you separate it like that, then it seems that having too much faith, yes, it's definitely a bad thing and it's not beneficial. However, if you limit yourself to the Judaism that was practiced in the time of Rabbi Akiva or Hillel, where there was some semblance of a court that could trace its authority all the way back to Moses, we could finally begin to prosper as a people.
There's a lot of truth in what you said, but not entirely. It's true that originally our ancestors cut down the Shabbos prayers, that instead of 18 or 19 prayers in the Amida, they cut it down to 7, because they felt that on Shabbos you shouldn't spend so much time as you would during the week davening. And then the joke of the matter is that over time it blossomed out, and the Shabbos service became, instead of 20 minutes to half an hour, as it usually is, and it now takes about 2.5 hours to go through the service. Yeah, you're right that things have a lot of things have been added. However, so that part I agree, but I don't agree that the original part of the service was totally rational. No, it was also put together ideas that are to teach people. For example, the Amida itself is filled with petitions that a rational person would not expect that God is going to interfere with nature and produce for him or her just because they're saying the Amida. So I think that when I said that the Siddur is a compendium of all kinds of documents, I would contend that that's true even from the original document, even from the days of Maimonides, and even earlier. In regard to Rabbi Akiva believed that the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, was from God, that God dictated it, and and God is perfect, and God knows how to speak without saying any extra words. So if there's seemingly a repetition, you need to interpret it. He went so far as to say even the S's, the Aleph, Tuf, need to be interpreted. Bereshis bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. Et is to be understood as not only the heaven, but everything that is in heaven. That his view was that everything needs to be, that there's no extra material in the Torah, and everything needs to be translated. Rabbi Ishmael took the opposite approach, and that's the approach of Maimonides, and that is that the Torah speaks in the language of human beings. And just like human beings repeat things for emphasis and or to make a poetic statement, the Torah does also. And a lot of things that Rabbi Akiva interpreted were pure nonsense. Like a fictional writer, he came up with interpretations because of his basic thinking that there's nothing superfluous in the Torah. That's an important concept that needs to be understood. When you read Rashi, for example, Rashi follows the teaching of Rabbi Akiva and is filled with midrashic stuff that drove his grandson Rashbam almost batty. There's a scholar that studied Rashbam, and points out that it's not just 3 or 4 things where Rashbam says that his grandfather didn't know what he was talking about. He actually said it that way. Virtually almost everything, not everything, but almost everything that Rashbam comments on was contrary to what his grandfather wrote. That's because Rashbam followed the methodology of Rabbi Yishmael, whereas Rashi followed the methodology of Rabbi Akiva. Being mean sometimes, I think to myself, there's a concept that when a person converts, in the sense of originally Rabbi Akiva was a peasant. According to the legend, he was such for 40 years, and then suddenly became righteous and studied. There's a psychological event that what happens is that the person becomes very strict
a zealot.
The zealot, and this is what happened to Rabbi Akiva. I think that is true.
So I think the Maimonidean approach to this is to make distinctions between halacha and agadata. That means
absolutely
that anything in Talmudic literature, rabbinic literature, that is of a prescriptive nature, we consider halacha, and everything that's just descriptive or is non-legal, we consider medrash, agadata. Like that, we can appreciate both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael as authoritative figures when they're dealing with legal issues. But anything regarding personal opinion, anything metaphysical, it's essentially optional to believe. I mean, even the Rambam talks about medical advice in Talmudic times. If people are willing to take midrashim literally, why don't they, if they have a stomach ache, why don't they put a chicken on their stomach? Or any primitive medical advice given over by Chazal? It's because they also make a distinction. And to the point that this phrase is popular in the Jewish world, that we don't hold like that. And that's typically on midrashic issues. So people pick and choose all the time, but the problem is nowadays the mystics say that everything was given on Mount Sinai. Every medrash, anything their Rebbe wrote was also given on Mount Sinai, and I consider that the huge dumbification of Judaism.
There were 2 things that you said that I have a different opinion about. One is, I don't know if you said it, but it did. I understood you to think that the Torah was given at Sinai. It's
well, the transmission began on Mount Sinai.
No. If you pay close attention, which I'm sure you do, to the events in chapter 19 and 20 of the Sinai experience, and what happens afterwards, you'll see that the Torah was not given at Sinai. Absolutely not. What occurred at Sinai was the revelation of the what people call the 10 Commandments, which actually are more than 10. The Torah doesn't call it 10 Commandments; it calls it Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 statements. So, first of all, the Torah was not given at Sinai. That's clear, as the Torah itself shows that. The Torah contains things that occurred afterwards. The other thing is that you said that if Rabbi Akiva came out with a prescriptive, or I would use the word maybe a mandate or a halacha, therefore we have to keep it. I don't see it that way. As I mentioned to you, Rabbi Akiva came up with these halachot because of his the way that he understood the Torah should be interpreted. If it missed a letter in the spelling, which it frequently does, we should derive a halacha from that. if you derive a halakha from a missing letter, a rational person would say that is clearly false.
Okay. Well, let me clarify my statement before we go further.
Okay.
When I say Torah, I don't mean the 5 books of Moses. I know colloquially that's what Torah means nowadays. The Rav Gaon writes in his commentary to Sefer Yeshua, he says that there's a statement before they enter Eretz Yisrael that God commands them to write the Torah on stones, like it's 12 stones, 6 stones, I can't remember right now. And then he asks, how can you write the whole Torah on such few stones? So the Rasag, he writes there that when it says Torah in Torah, it means the commandments within the Torah. It's true, there's clearly more than 613 commandments, right? The whole Taryag Mitzvot is more like of a tradition, right? The Rambam followed that tradition. This is why he limited his to 613, Maimonides as well. But it seems that whole transmission, because it was instructional, came to be known to us as Torah. But not that the 5 books of Moses were given on Mount Sinai and as some sort of almanac of things to come, and they were in some way reading the future before it even occurred. This is the rational perspective of it. But I know even to make such a statement sounds heretical to the average Haredi Jew.
That's right.
Let's see. There's another.
About Rabbi Akiva.
Oh, right. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Sanhedrin that all the dinim were voted into existence. That means this is why we have this notion that unless you have a court of greater number and greater wisdom, you can't overrule something that a previous court ruled into existence. So there's personal opinion, and then there are actual votes in the Sanhedrin. So this is why I was never, even if someone would say that the Zohar was written by Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, it really wouldn't matter because anything halachic in there would just be his opinion. It's not the court. This is the notion of Elu ve'elu Devrei Elokim Chaim, that all the rulings that came either from the students of Hillel or the students from Shammai, if they were voted and agreed upon in some way. Now, at that time, there wasn't much disagreement. I think there were 18 things or 14 things that Shammai wouldn't compromise on. But as long as it was voted in unison in this court, right, under the auspices of the Nasi, then it's binding. Like this, we can eliminate any chumras or any personal opinions that are just sort of wacky. The bigger question is, how can we distinguish a halacha that came via the court or a halachic practice that was instituted by some over-eccentric Tana?
Okay, I hear what you're saying. My approach is a little bit different.
To move from this topic, I have an organization called Torah Judaism International, and we do something that most Orthodox organizations do not do, and that's that we proselytize. We encourage Gentiles to consider becoming Jewish. If they're looking for a religious ethical outlet and they happen not to have a religion currently, we encourage them to consider becoming Jewish. How do you feel about this idea that Jews do not proselytize?
By the way, there's also the Chabad does a lot of that stuff, and also
yeah, but they do it only for Jews. That's the thing. Or they'll try to spread the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, but they won't.
Yeah.
They won't actually spread Torah to Gentiles.
Yeah, the Rebbe was, I don't know if you know, but I had meetings with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he asked me to do something, and I did it. Then after I did it, I wrote him and I told him that I did what he requested, but that he asked me because I was a general. So I said I did it because you requested it, but I want you to know that I'm not Chabad, but I follow Maimonides. And he wrote me back and said that he also follows Maimonides, which I thought was a great joke.
Chabad made Mishnah Torah Yomi famous,
Okay, but I didn't answer your point.
Yeah, go
ahead. What you're doing could be very nice. My own view is I'm not interested in that because I believe that everyone has a right to think what they want to think, and it doesn't bother me As a lawyer, I'm reminded of the First Amendment, which I don't know if you know that I handled a big case for the government where the government was challenged that the chaplaincy was a violation of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law establishing religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So I handled that case and won it, and was awarded. But the rule in regard to behavior, the part which says that we're not allowed to infringe upon an individual's free exercise rights, that applies only when the person is not in any way harming anyone else. A person can believe whatever they want to believe. They can think whatever they want to think. They could say whatever they want to say, as long as they do no harm to anyone else. And that concept is one that I ascribe to, and therefore it doesn't bother me at all, emotionally or intellectually, if someone has a foolish idea, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. It just doesn't bother me. I know that at least before I reached age 86, I was considered to be very, very smart. But I know that most people are not, and so they have a different idea. It doesn't bother me. So I'm really not interested in
I was thinking more as an alternative to destructive belief systems. It seems like if we don't offer the populace something, and then they could possibly become radical Islamists or radical atheists, right? So it seems that the way we combat bad religion and bad ideology is with good religion and good ideology. So because we're forced to share a planet with so many people, I think from my perspective that it behooves us to say what's good for us is good for others. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Uh-huh.
I personally would not want to do it, but your intention is beautiful and helpful to others and to society generally. Yeah.
So for the last question, which one of your books do you feel has helped the most people?
I don't know the answer to that.
Now, you have books extending from Jewish history all the way to novels. So
yeah. Oh, okay. I think the one that is the most popular book is the 5 books that I supposedly did with, can't think of his name right now, but on Targum Onkelos. That book, that set of 5 books is very popular, and hopefully it'll stop the wrong approach that people are taking in regard to Targum Onkelos. A number of books have recently been written after I wrote mine, in which the authors try to point out that Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translator, was not just simply translating, but was teaching lessons. That's totally incorrect. Hopefully my view will catch on. And at any event, that book is very popular. I mean, that series is very popular. Another book that is very popular is my book in which I think it's called For God and Country. That's the book in which I describe how I saved the military chaplaincy, and that one sold a whole lot of copies.
So I think your co-author on the set on Onkelos was Stanley Wagner, correct?
That's right. Very nice fellow.
That's actually how I learned it, that Onkelos was used because there's a halacha to study the Torah twice in Hebrew, once in the Targum, and I think literally means in the common tongue, but I mean they for some reason limited
No,
it to Onkelos.
what that means is that you should. The way that I put it was that the people who said this were the people who wrote Midrashim, and they said that you should study Targum Onkelos because what they were saying is that besides studying our Midrashim, you should know exactly what the Torah is saying, what it literally is saying.
So it seems like they use Onkelos to in some way indoctrinate the people on a specific understanding of the Chumash. If they wanted...
Nowadays, the Art Scroll people, for example, use Targum Onkelos to do that. But that's not what Targum Onkelos is doing. Mm-hmm. Targum Onkelos is a literal translation.
Well, they do the same thing with Rashi. This is why I'm not a big fan of the Art Scroll stone Chumash, because they'll take a verse and translate it not according to the literal translation, but according to what Rashi says. Rashi says the translation is. And I think the Gutnick, the Chabad edition, does the exact same thing. In this case, I think Christian translations are in some way more accurate than many Orthodox translations. The JPS, I think it's great.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I want to thank you for taking the time. What website can people look up if they want to know more about you?
What I gave you last time.
So it's booksandthoughts.com, but the and is just the letter N. So it's booksandthoughts.com.
Yeah, books is plural and thoughts is plural, and the N is just letter. Today I put on one about things that we think we know about the matriarch Rachel, which are really obscure. It's a book I'm writing right now, and I'm going to send it off to the editor before the end of the year. In essence, it's pointing out that virtually everything in the 5 books of Moses is obscure. You think you understand what's going on, but you really don't.
Thank you, Dr. Rabbi Israel Drazin, Esquire.